Viva Chile, viva Chile, a Chile quiero, chileno yo soy.
All right, welcome back to the last section, or segment, excuse me, of Red Hot Chili for the middle of April 2014. Still talking about the benefits of chili over what you have in the United States and elsewhere. Here's some more. We talked about taxes. There's less control here by Monsanto and all Pfizer and these other groups over the food supply and little high fructose corn syrup or GMOs and products sold in the supermarkets. Now, that's not to say Walmart's not trying. They bought Leader Supermarkets, which is a huge chain here, and they get all those, you get all sorts of goods coming in from the U.S. that are being sold here that have that in it, but it's still easy to get products that are not that way. So that's a benefit. Some people think that's all a bunch of gibberish. I'm no scientist. I'm just making a comment here. For a lot of folks that I talk to, it's a big benefit having the food be of higher quality. Not the food's perfect. It's not necessarily organic in Chile, but it certainly is better quality than other places. Inflation is usually under control here with the central bank that is more sound than nearly all others like to have sound in quotes there, because it's still a fiat system. It's because it's bound to this unidad de fomento thing that it mitigates the impact or risk of inflation. Salaries are adjusted by there's an automatic cost of living for everybody, and there's really no point in inflating because there's a constant catch-up, whether it's all time deposit salaries or debts, and so nobody's really hurt by inflation here. It's been that way for many years. Big plus. Social Security is private here. That's a big deal. How do you like being ripped off in the United States or in Europe better? With all, large percentage of your salary that you're going to be paying into a Ponzi scheme may never see, and it's just completely manipulated by them. At least here, you're forced to pay into it, or the government, the employer is forced to pay it for you. At least you get a mutual fund statement you can check out every month online and see what you've got. It's your money, and you can't touch it till you're 65 again. Women can touch it when they're 60, but still, it's a whole lot better to have that than the other. Unemployment insurance is also private. You save up a little bit from your check every month, and if you get unemployed, you get laid off or whatever, well, it's yours to use. Usually you get about, a typical person gets about 3, 4, maybe 5 months of unemployment benefits that way. Medical insurance is far cheaper than in the USA, making it quality care more accessible and frequent, which is great for your own health, I think. A good piece. Internet and cell service is generally faster and more reliable in Chile than much of the USA. And I was talking about the larger cities in Chile. Some places in rural areas, rural parts are not that great. But boy, I'll tell you what, my service here at the internet and cell phone both are way better than I ever had in the US. Europe is great for cell service, and I would say Chile is on par with that. Libertarians are listened to, published, and can possibly get a candidate elected to Congress. Can you say that in the United States or Europe? I don't think so. Traditional family values are still highly regarded. Children do not divorce parents or abandon the elderly as much as in other places. And even divorced parents tend to share time with children more here than in other places. This is number 23. I skipped one. Well, anyway, number 23. There's much less violent crime, muggings, carjackings, murders. In fact, there's really hardly any of them. Muggings and carjackings like that. Maybe somebody's got a knife, but it's not the same here. However, they do knock off ATM machines pretty often. No victims there except for the central bank's got to print a few more pieces of paper. There's very little racism here. Some people think there's racism, really not. Racism is really exclusively for Indian tribes, like the Mapuches. You can be black, Oriental, whatever. Don't care here. There's not a lot of racism. Maybe somebody is, but it's relatively uncommon. There are far fewer homeless people here than in the USA, although I have to admit stray dogs are an endemic problem. Property rights are very strong here. This has got to be really high on the list too, and I'm going in no particular order here, as you realize. And much less property is confiscated on account of illegal drugs or RICO raids or prostitution scams, or not to mention things like spotted owls or wetlands. Corruption is very low in Chile, although you can also say the same for many other first world countries which are otherwise despicable. There is no occupancy or housing quality requirements, which of course just raise costs and make life harder for poorer people. This is a much freer market in that sense. The national debt is very low as a percentage of GDP here. Can't say that in America, can you? How about some of your European countries doing real well? Italy? Anybody else? Any other takers for good debt control for the federal government? Fiscal discipline and responsibility is far higher in Chile than those places. The quality and sweetness, if applicable, as I say, of fruits and vegetables is higher here, while prices are vastly lower. If you doubt it, especially if you come from Europe, you're going to see it right off the bat. There's some places in the U.S. you can still get some pretty good stuff, but here in Chile you have much higher quality, so I've traveled a lot than other places in the world. Unemployment is far lower than other places in the world, 6.1% currently. That's up from 5.3 last year. Of course, that benefit is really mainly for people who can speak Spanish and get a job here. People coming in without Spanish are having a difficult time. Homosexuality is largely in the closet and widely frowned upon. Your chance of surviving a major natural disaster is higher in Chile than elsewhere in the first world. And you should have known that from these last couple, volcanoes, earthquakes, and other things we've had here the last few years. People like large families in Chile, and many wish, as they say, they could afford this quote-unquote more children. So that's good if you have a big family. You're not going to be criticized for it, as that happened to me in the U.S. Chile has a booming, bustling, growing, and dynamic economy. You got to say that's worth something, right? Spanking one's children is not a crime and is even encouraged by the police. Heard it myself from the cops. There's no Obamacare or mandatory socialized medicine. Hello, Europe. You're going to have better quality medical care, a lot less cost. Forget about your free medical care in those places, or Canada. There's no institutionalized welfare state or entitlement mentality here. The Chilean federal government budget is so small it's about the same size as South Korea's biggest company, Samsung. It's relatively easy and cheap to obtain residency visa and eventual citizenship if one follows the rules in the process. Number 41 is where we are now. There's no DEA, EPA, FDA, or FCC, and their Chilean equivalents are far more benign. Or pick your alphabet soup people in your country of choice. Those are U.S. agencies. Number 42, there's no production of kiddie porn, and in general, Chileans do not molest or abuse children. Now, there are some cases you hear about. It's awful. It's everywhere in the world. You have sick people that do this kind of stuff, but we don't produce kiddie porn. Chileans do not understand why Americans or Europeans or Japanese or others want to watch children having sex. So the culture just doesn't tolerate it here. And that's probably true in most of Latin America, but especially here in Chile. The state does not constrain churches about what they may or may not preach. That seems to be a pretty important piece if you're a libertarian. It's not offensive to display the 10 Commandments or religious symbols in public or government buildings either. They have 10 Commandments and 2 big stones, tablets in the high-class area of Santiago on Kayway Avenue. There are many true and not manipulative U.S. Controlling free trade agreements with many places in the world in Chile. There's no NSA HARP program or spying on citizens in Chile. There's no long-term capital gains tax for individuals that sell appreciated property that has been owned for more than a year. Estate taxes on investment gains can be avoided through life insurance. There's no TEFRA Act like in the U.S. Chile has far fewer idiots in the political process, as far as I can tell. We don't have like this famous Hank Johnson guy who thought that Guam could actually, as an island, be tipped over and capsized. It's ridiculous. I mean, these kind of clowns that get elected up there. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. We could talk about Barbara Boxer, Dianne Feinstein, and I mean, let's face it, Hillary Clinton's no genius, and Obama, and frankly, I'd say that same for most of the Republicans. As a good libertarian, I think Republicans are even more dangerous than Democrats in the United States. And most of those guys are just, well, you know what I think of them, and every other libertarian. Chile does not have Harvard. We don't have Yale, Princeton, Berkeley, Stanford, Wisconsin, Madison, or 100 other universities that promote ideologies and policies that undermine freedom. Don't have it here. Sorry. Don't even have women's studies programs in universities. Or we don't have all sorts of weird stuff that you get produced in the United States. Marriages are registered here rather than receiving a license or permission, which is granted by the state. And it's possible through this kind of registration to remove the incentive that women have, like in the U.S., to divorce their husbands by separating the goods from the start. So they don't have any access. A lawyer can never get those assets from the husband. It's a great system to change the incentives of women and lawyers. 52, there's banking secrecy that protects account holder information in all but the most severe cases in Chile. And that requires a special warrant from the High Court. There are opportunities to hire inexpensive, and especially outside of northeastern Santiago, household help and maids, that serve as cleaners, babysitters, cooks, launderers, people that help care for the elderly. It's a very important piece of Chilean lifestyle that you can't really afford outside. And Chileans take civic and religious holidays very more seriously than average Americans nowadays. Frank Szabo sent this in, Frank and Madeline Szabo, I appreciate this. He said they're much less commercialized. No one dies, he says, in the store if the stores are not open 24 hours a day leading up to Christmas. And then Claudia also sent in a comment basically noting that women are never put on the front lines here in Chile, whether it's in the military specifically, and probably not in firefighters. You don't see any female firefighters being out there, you know, and doing dangerous work. Even here in Valparaiso recently, we had 15 people have died in these horrible fires. And I think the majority of them are firefighters, maybe some police officers. So it's sad to see when that happens, and of course when anybody dies, but especially you know, those people that really risk their lives to save and help other people. And the bomberos as they're called here, the firefighters are all a volunteer force. Well, folks, that is 55 reasons. 55 reasons. I think are pretty powerful reasons. And some, depending on your tastes, preferences, experiences, religious convictions, personal preferences, you know, your lifestyle choices, whether you're a Christian or not, or whatever. As a libertarian, whatever your stripe or flavor, those 55 things, and some way or another, touch, you know, some kind of muscle deep down or bone. They're really great at you. That the United States has a problem. That Canada, Europe, these other places in the world that where you all live now in so-called first world civilizations have these problems. Here in Chile, we are way better on every one of those points. That's huge. So when people ask me, why can you promote Chile so much when they've got lying, bureaucracy, pickpockets, classism, and all the other 12 major things I read, as well as pollution, and somebody sent this, I think Stephen Yates in his post said this, you know, pollution in Santiago, you know, you don't have to live in Santiago if you live in Chile. Chile's a big country, by the way. If you don't like the smog, live in Viña del Mar. We don't have that problem, just to put a footnote on that. But, you know, all those problems that we have here are real problems and they're real defects. But you know what, compared to the other things that you face, the 55 other reasons, I think they, in a relative sense, pale by comparison. The benefits of living in Chile far exceed the costs. And if you're prepared for those costs, if you know ahead of time because you've read my books, you listen to the radio show, you read the blog, you can deal with it. You can come prepared and handle it far better. And just remember to read the same post about 4 or 5 years after you're here. And you start complaining and thinking about how green the grass is on the other side and how wonderful it was back in Egypt where those leeks and onions were just so tasty and it was so secure. And we had all our friends and it wasn't so bad. It is bad. That's why you're thinking of leaving. It stinks where you are. It's really bad. It's not okay. It's not getting better. It's getting worse. So that's why I promote come to Chile. Another thing in Chile is we have some hope here. Now, I'm not saying Chile's a perfect place or it's definitely going to change. But if we have enough people immigrate here with these kinds of libertarian ideas, they will listen to us. And we may actually be able to affect a change here. They like Americans. They like listening to our ideas. I published in the last 30 months almost 1,300 letters to the editor. You know, one might get published 10 times. That's how the numbers are so high. But they're very libertarian in nature, and they get listened to. And that's an important piece because this country has hope for the future. We might actually be able to move ahead. Well, anyway, I think this is an important show for YouTube, and I notice I've been looking down towards Viña. It's now even better in Valparaiso than it was before for YouTube listeners. I hope this is a lecture, or if you want to call it a lecture, because I'm talking like a college professor. A radio show that's going to be useful in encouraging people to come to Chile, count the cost, but also understand the benefits and realize what you're facing, where you're staying right now. Come here, help us establish liberty in this country. Well, this has been an interesting show. We've come to the end here, but here we are, rocks in the background, waves crashing on the beach. Never done a radio show on the beach, but it's been fun. Hope you've enjoyed it. You can be down here in the middle of April, the middle of your equivalent of November in Northern Hemisphere too. This is Red Hot Chile on the Overseas Radio Network, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Thanks for joining us. Very much for listening on the YouTube. I'm sorry you haven't had a lot of eye contact with me today, but I have to monitor all these things, especially as you can imagine how hard it is for the producer who has to stand back behind the camera all day, and maybe he'll give you a picture of himself. Why don't you come over here, Joe, so they can just see you for a minute. That he has actually been out here doing the work on the beach as we record this for the YouTube broadcast. Glad you joined us again for the radio show today. Hope it's useful for you and your thoughts about where to go. This is not a perfect place, but it's a great place to come, and it's got a lot of future, and it's a whole lot better, let's face it, folks, than what you're dealing with right now. And I'm very glad to be here. I'm not saying I would never go anywhere else, at least for a short period of time, but I realize that this is the place to go if you've got you know, a family to raise and you want a bigger country to be with. If you got the money to go to Hong Kong or go to Singapore or go live in, you know, an island, you like to do that, great, go for it. But for most people, this is the optimal choice right now in the world. So anyway, I'll be signing off, and thanks for joining us today from Reñaca Beach here in Viña del Mar, Chile.